Hello.
Hi.
Hi everyone.
Why have you got such a big couch and I got such a
You're in the
small
center. I'm lounging.
Okay, good.
It's the weekend. We've made it through the week. Well, Ross did an amazing introduction for you, and for me. Thank you. That was very generous. I guess I'm going to say a few more things about you, because although he's given you some details, there's a few things I think people need to know to understand your background a bit. So hopefully I can do that justice, and then we can get started. I know you hate this part.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, good. So you can just sit there for a second, and I'm going to do this part. So Kumi has been a human rights and environmental activist for a very long time. You started your work in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, where, in your teens, where you were arrested a bunch of times for neighborhood organizing, community youth work, mass mobilization. So you left for the UK, and then in 1994, I believe, you went back to South Africa to help set up the ANC and oversee the first democratic elections of that country. As Ross mentioned, you've been the International Executive Director of Greenpeace International and Secretary General of Amnesty International, which is a mouthful, but I'm still not done. You're on the Global Leadership Council to the Sanitation and Water for All. Now these names get difficult, I'm just going to say. A Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy, and since June of 2020, you've been a global ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. So that's a lot of stuff. I'm going to start by actually reading a quote from you, which I think sets the scene really well, and then ask you a whole bunch of questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Great. So there's this thing, you were interviewed recently, and you said, "We are living in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we do in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future we have, and whether we have a future at all. We still have a window of opportunity, but if we're brutally honest, that window of opportunity is small, and it's fast closing." You've now been here for a week for COP. How do you feel that relates to that sentiment of that quote?
Well, sadly, the gap between where the science and extreme weather events are on the one hand, and where the politics and the economics is on the other, is far too wide. But if I can just take one step back
Please.
and say thanks both to Ross and to Maryam for that very kind introduction. But, you know, there's another way they could have introduced me. They could have said, "This guy has been at it for 15 years and he's got very little to show for it." Because look at the state of the world. And I say this partly tongue-in-cheek only, because this is a time for brutal honesty. We do not have time to faff around anymore, right? Just be clear. This is not about saving the planet. The planet actually does not need saving, if you think about it. If we continue on the trajectory that we are, a trajectory that we could call a suicidal trajectory, the end result is we will continue to deplete our water resources, destroy our soil, warm up the planet. We are unable to produce food that humanity needs. The end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And for everybody who's worried about saving the planet, the good news is once we become extinct as a species, the oceans will recover, the forests will grow back, and so on. So let's understand that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is about protecting our children and their children's futures. It's about protecting humanity. And just with what's happening with the so-called leaders in there, they have a really, really bad case of cognitive dissonance, where all the facts are saying that we need to change fast, and they are delaying. By the way, I was not being rude by opening my phone when you were introducing me. I'll eventually sort it out and find it, but there's a breaking piece of news that I would like to share with you all related to what's happening in there, once I've figured out how to open it.
Well, let me ask you a few questions, and we'll try and find that piece of news. I think it would be great, as we're here, we might as well discuss what's going on here and now. I've had a chance to speak to you a few times, and you talk about this idea of failing. So I want to ask both sides of that question. I want to ask where is activism getting it right, and where is it getting it wrong?
That's an excellent question, and that's exactly the question that we need to ask. We need to ask, what do we continue doing? What do we stop doing? And what do we start doing? Things that we are not doing. So let me say that I think one of the biggest mistakes we are making is that understandably, right? And by the way, any mistake that I reflect on, I'm culprit number one. Okay, so I'm not. It's not a criticism against anybody else. It's much a self-criticism as a community criticism. So I think what activism has not been able to balance is that we focus so much on how people are excluded, exploited, marginalized, oppressed, repressed, and so on. And of course, we have to do that. But if you don't balance that with the reality that notwithstanding that which governments and corporations do on people, that people still have massive amounts of agency, massive amounts of capability, massive amount of talent, massive amount of courage. And if we don't harness that, nurture that, and deploy that in an equal way to talking about what people don't have, we have to also talk about what people have. So, if you're an artist in a community, you have power to do murals. If you're a teacher, you have the capability to educate not just the children in your class, but people in your community. If you're an engineer, you can explore renewable energy projects at a grassroots level in your community. So people have talents, and we need to be able to create an enabling environment for those talents to be emerged. The idea that the definition of activists is somebody like me who has worked full-time in an organization that is engaged in activism needs to be broken. We need to say that activism, you can be a teacher, you can be a librarian, you can be a cleaning worker. All of these professions don't deny you the possibility of being, and the idea of full-time activism is far too overrated. We also have to be looking at what people do normally in the day-to-day lives. The second big mistake we make, and some of you might get upset with what I'm about to say now, early warning. Do you know one person that could be our hero is Steve Bannon?
I mean, this is very controversial, so you're going to have to explain yourself quite quickly.
Yeah, I'll have to explain myself. For those of you who don't know Steve Bannon, he was the campaign manager of Trump. So one of the things that Steve Bannon and right-wing ideologues understand much better than progressives seem to understand is that politics does not drive culture and society. It is culture that drives politics and society. So what activism has tended to do is we've had a more of a aggressive secularist approach, right? Where we've dismissed people's cultural sort of affinities because sometimes they're very objectionable to us, right? But activism cannot be about simply taking a position and organizing the people that already agree with you and maybe winning a few people who slightly disagree with you. Because that means you get about 10, 15% of a society and you're leaving 85% behind. Activism has to be moving forward. An enterprise where we are consciously trying to win over the people that disagree with us. And in that sense, right, I would say to folks here in the UK, I know many of you have been devastated. My daughter is Scottish, and I know how devastated she was when the Brexit vote went the way that it did, right? But we have to learn to love the people that voted for Brexit. We have to understand why they voted for Brexit. We need to understand how they were manipulated for voting. You go to Aberdeen, talk to the fisher folk there, who were, misled into thinking that you vote for Brexit, then you're going to have more fish that you can catch. And now they're being told for 25 years nothing will change, right? So a lot of lies. And as for listen, it is a joke for us, and it should be an embarrassment for every British citizen that you got a prime minister who is a fundamental racist in Boris Johnson. And if any of you thinking that I'm speaking through my ass here, sorry.
It's okay, it's free, it's Saturday, you can say that.
Okay. I just want to quote you something that he said in 2002. In an article, black and white in Spectator magazine. He said, the best thing that can happen to Africa is if Europeans scrambled in a direction again And this time they shouldn't have to apologize. I mean, this is what your Prime Minister says, right? So
we're not going to get the leadership from there.
no,
Where
you're
are
not going to.
where are we
Leadership
gonna get the
on
leadership
climate,
from?
sadly, not only in your country, but also in my country, is not going to come from the politicians. We have to take leadership from bottom up. We have to make it impossible for them not to be able to act in the ways that they need to act. Sorry, there was a bit of a long answer. But,
No, but tell me, I want to explore that all a little bit. What are some really great examples of how that communication has worked? You know, where we have communicated in lots of different ways effectively with people who don't always agree with us.
So,
Really?
can I give one bad example of communication? And then while
Yes.
I'm doing that, I'll try and think really hard about what I can say is a good example. So, you know, in 2012, I was on an inflatable boat on my way to occupy an oil rig in Greenland when I was at Greenpeace. And while we were on the boat, my colleagues could see that I was shit scared because I can't swim very well. And the ocean was really turbulent. And they turned to me and said, you know, don't worry, Kumi, if you fall into the water, it's okay. With what you're wearing, the special suit you're wearing, you'll survive at least 2 hours. and we'll be able to fish you out, right? And I looked at how big the waves were, and I'm thinking, shoo, maybe they're going to need more than 2 hours to find me. And then I was thinking, shoo, if I kicked it here today, if this is the last protest that I was being involved in, and I looked at the placard that I was carrying, and this was already in 2012 when nobody was talking about the Arctic, where now I think more people understand the Arctic is sort of the refrigerator and the air conditioner of the planet, so to speak. And I thought, but Banner said, stop Arctic destruction. I'm thinking 99.99% of my family, my friends, my comrades back home in Africa wouldn't have a clue what that stop Arctic destruction meant. And then after that, I was talking to some kids in the family.
Survived? You
I
survived?
survived, I survived. Oh, it was cold, but I did survive. After 1 week in prison, which, by the way, was relaxation. I went to bed every day at 9 p.m., and I woke up at 7 a.m. I never slept such good sleep, anyway. But when I was talking to some kids when I got back home to Africa and in my family, and one of the kids said, you know, Uncle Kumi, that was a stupid slogan, stop Arctic destruction. Nobody understood it. You know what would have been a better slogan? Save Santa Claus now. Think about it. Save Santa Claus now. What's behind that? And I thought, you know, that was absolutely brilliant, actually. I mean, by the way, I do know that Santa Claus doesn't exist, okay? But what was behind that was one of the mistakes, again, that activism makes is we project our consciousness on the people that we're trying to organize. Rather than humbling ourselves, understanding where people are, and building on what they know, and getting them to where we need them to be. And so the only association that ordinary people in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and all have with the Arctic is that Santa Claus is chilling there most of the year and he comes down once in a while at Christmas, right? However fictional it might be, and you know, I could have actually done that action with the Santa Claus, you know, suit climbing the rig. It would have probably had more media impact and so on. But there are examples where when, like I want to give you one example from my childhood activism when I was about 17. So in the neighboring township where I lived, called Lamontville, there was a campaign to address high rents, high transport, you know, bus fares, and generally the high cost of living. And you know, normally when activists get together, they'll write if you're lucky, they'll write a 2-page manifesto on all the demands and all the things that need to happen, and you know, there'll be lots of big words and you know, about structural change and systemic change. By the way, again, I say all these mistakes I've made. But you know, the people in the community came up with one word in Zulu, Asina Maali. Right? It's like you spell it in one word, but in English it's about 3 words, which basically says, we have no money. Right? But sometimes the simplicity of communication speaks to people much more than, trying to be too wordy, too theoretical, especially when you think about climate. I mean, people are lost between degrees, parts per million, targets, and so on. And to be fair, climate communications is one of the most challenging things to explain to people, right? But I would humbly say those of us who've been in the climate movement are fundamentally part of the problem, because we start talking in a way that we think everybody should just be talking like us, rather than saying we need to understand where people are and engage with that reality.
And this is for you where arts and culture comes in, right?
Absolutely.
And you're going to be spending quite a bit of time working on this. And you've today released something with the artist Olafur Eliasson, whose name I can never say, guys. Olafur Eliasson. I've got to say it properly. Can you tell us a bit about this? Because I think that you're dedicating quite a significant portion of your time looking at how, and given the environment we are in and this whole event, how we bring arts and culture into this movement, and I guess the different roles it can play. Because we've talked about how you don't see it as just a tool, right? It's not just a means to an end.
Well, firstly, I should say that and this is the thing about, I suddenly said, let me go back and think about it as a young person. Because when we were mobilizing in South Africa, one of the worst things we had to deal with was the fact that our government had ensured that our majority of our people couldn't read and write. What people sometimes don't know, that the most vicious statement, right, of the apartheid regime was about education. The architect of apartheid, Vervoet, said, and I quote, "Blacks should never be shown the greener pastures of education. They should know that their role in life is to be carriers of water and hewers of wood," right? And basically people were consciously deprived of education because education was understood as something that gives you sort of empowerment. So within our context, where the majority of our people couldn't read and write, we had to use arts and culture. In fact, I remember when as a 22-year-old, when I fled to the UK, and I used to speak at various anti-apartheid gatherings here. Like if I did it at universities where not only the anti-apartheid people would come, also the sort of people who were more pro-apartheid would come, I would get people and say, "Excuse me, how is it that people in your country sing and dance at funerals? How uncivilized is that?" People sang and danced at funerals because we were saying to the oppressor, you can do whatever you want, you'll never defeat our spirit. We were saying to the families that lost the loved ones, the loved one that you lost is a life that you should be proud of and celebrate that life because that person died for a good cause, for justice, and so on. So for me, arts and culture collaborates, and Olafur Eliasson has done amazing work already to actually bring the climate. I would say what Olafur has done, right, as an artist, to raise awareness on climate change is much more than I did as the head of Greenpeace. I'll give you one simple example.
Because again, that's quite a statement. So
Yeah,
give us the example.
Yeah, because if activism is not about broadening the understanding of the largest numbers of people so that they can use their agency to get involved directly and not sit back and wait for a Kumi Naidoo or whoever else to do their activism for them. What is activism about? Activism has to be able to enable people to take, because basically people have been made to be spectators in something that they should be central players in. Right? This fight to secure our children's future, requires now, the example I want to give. Just to say, like, the creativity of an artist like Olafur, and there are many other artists doing amazing things. So Olafur calls me up when I was the Secretary General for Amnesty and said, "Kumi, you need to come to Iceland. And we're getting Mary Robinson to come," and Olafur's partner, Adil Ibrahim, also an activist, said, "We need both of you there because we want to have a funeral." I said, "You want to have a funeral? What funeral do you want to have?" He says, "No, we want to have a funeral for the first iceberg in Iceland that completely is dead and can never come alive again. Okay, whatever you can do is never going to recover it. So, to be honest, I thought it was a little bit, originally I thought like, wow, this is way out there. And then anyway, Mary Robinson, myself, the Prime Minister of Iceland, we stood there with about close to 600-700 people. We expressed our condolences to the iceberg for dying. Then we walked up the iceberg, the dead iceberg now, there's no ice, but just the mountain. There was a plaque that was put in. The plaques had something like, at this point that we put this plaque, this ice, this glacier has died. But we know at this point in history that it is within our capability as humanity to turn this thing around, even though the window of opportunity is small. Whether we succeed or not, if you are reading this now, then it probably means we have succeeded. So like if 100 years from now people go up and they're able to read it. So I am convinced that we need to bring the worlds of arts and culture and the world of activism together. And if I might say that if even if you want to look at left-wing analysis, right, and take two left-wing thinkers, ironically, one of them is Antonio Gramsci, the Italian socialist, who, by the way, his thinking is what Steve Bannon and before him Karl Rove have been using to mobilize the right, because he said you needed to understand the structure of civil society, the churches, the schools, the cultural groups, the savings clubs, and so on, and you need to find ways to bring them closer into the fight for justice. The other is Louis Althusser. Anybody knows Louis Althusser? Let's see if any old people here. No. So Althusser was, a left-wing sociologist from France. He was so brilliant that he was like one step away from insanity, and he actually died in a mental asylum. But at the height of his academic powers, he said one of the mistakes we make is thinking that governments and corporations control us mainly through the deployment of what he called the repressive state apparatus, army, police, formal laws, and so on. And while, of course, he acknowledged that was very important and constrained and create the space for political life and civic life, he argued that the more insidious and more powerful form of control is not the repressive state apparatus, but is in fact the ideological state apparatus, by which he means the framework for education, framework for schooling, social norms and customs, the funding of arts and culture, and most crucially and critically, the framework for communications and media. Donald Trump, and before him, George Bush, won with minorities of the American people. That when you look at exactly what percentage of the eligible people to vote, they had George Bush had a 25% mandate, because 50% of the people voted, and it was split almost enough, right? So there's no question, therefore, that we can have all the great analysis, we can talk about how unjust things are, but if we cannot communicate that to ordinary people who should be at the center of the struggle, we're going to fail, and that's why I think we need arts and culture to help us with that.
So you said at the very beginning this idea of everyone looking at the areas in which they have influence, or the tools they're bringing, if you're an artist, if you're a teacher, if you're an engineer. Do you think then this movement and this conversation is actually a lot more personal, in that it's not just about trying to have big impact in big spaces, but actually having impact with the people you speak to every day, with the communities that you're a part of?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, one of the things I always used to ask my colleagues in Greenpeace, Amnesty, and other places that I've worked is, do your parents understand what you engaged in? And okay, let's just stop now, right? And let me put everybody in the spot, right? Just think about your families. The fact that you attended an event like this suggests where your values and your views are, right? But let's just stop for a moment, right? Unless we can start with the people around us, right? So I think, because basically, why is our own families, Why is our own friends, why is our own work colleagues not the normal place to start? Right? We have to start with the people around us, and those people are teachers to us. They are teaching us how to frame, how to, and let me just say, like when you take the question of racism, right? There are many people in UK who would say, I'm not a racist, right? And probably it's true, they're not racist. But there's a difference between not being a racist and being anti-racist, right? So if you're not a racist, then you would sit in a conversation with family members, right? And your family members would be making racist comments, right? And you say, okay, yeah, stay quiet. You don't say anything. And then the moment that function is over, then the 2 or 3 other people in your family that you know that are also not racist, you then say, oh, the Uncle Jimmy made me feel so uncomfortable, I really wanted to give him a kick up his back or whatever. And I'm not saying that the way to approach it is to be arrogant, because that's the other thing. If there's one thing I learned, activism must become humble. Activism must not claim that we have the solutions to everything, because if we had the solutions to everything, why the hell are you in such deep shit now? Right? No, and if we don't have humility, then we are part of the problem. If we cannot understand that we are failing, I have to make a confession at this point. I know we're probably running out of time, so I'm going to ask my friend Nathan at the back. Nathan, if you can find that breaking news, and please bring it on your phone so I can share it to people. I don't know why I can't find it, but keep
yeah,
going.
Nathan, we want it.
Yeah.
Okay, wait, but I have a question, because being like in this analogy, and then it's not just an analogy, but being anti-racist is hard, right? Like if you're sitting there with racist Uncle Jim and he's going off, you're gonna have to have some hard conversations. Thank you. You've been having those hard conversations now for so much of your life. Where do people get the energy? Where do you get the energy to keep having those conversations that are difficult and exhausting?
Okay, just because I'm scared I'll lose the
go.
the
We're going to pause
yeah.
my question.
So
Tell me.
I'm coming back to that, right? So yesterday there was some great news out of Australia, and I just want to share it with you that pertains to the elections. It might sound unrelated, but listen to the words carefully. The headline was, "Man announces that he will quit drinking by 2050." A Sydney man has set an ambitious target to phase out his alcohol consumption within the next 20 years. Right? Oops. As part of an impressive plan to improve his health. The program will see Greg Taylor, 73, continue to drink as normal for the foreseeable future, before reducing consumption in 2049, when he turns 101. He has assured friends it will not affect his drinking plans in the short or medium term. Taylor said it was important not to rush the switch to non-alcoholic beverages. And I quote, "It's not realistic to transition to zero alcohol overnight. This requires a steady, phased approach where nothing changes for at least 2 decades." He said, adding that he may need to make additional investments in beer consumption in the short term to make sure no night out is worse off. Taylor will also be able to bring forward drinking credits earned from the days he hasn't drunk over the past 40 years, meaning the actual end date for consumption may actually be 2060. To assist with the transition, Taylor has bought a second beer fridge, which he describes as the capture and storage method. Okay, now this is brilliant, right? This
is brilliant.
is a piece of journalism. This is a piece of journalism out of Australia called The Shovel, right? But this answers your first question. Yeah. That's what's going on there. Because basically, it's all about system recovery, system protection, system maintenance, when what we need is system redesign, system transformation, and And basically, when we think about climate change, it just didn't happen. It's a result of a broken economic system that has driven us here, a broken energy system, transport system, and so on. We need massive, massive, massive change. And then to come to your question about why, what keeps me going.
Yeah, because then I have another question for you
Okay.
that is the real question I want to ask you.
Okay.
So first tell me this one.
Okay, so if you are anything like me, right, I'm sure there are days that you wake up and you feel desperate. You read the news, you look what's happening around you, you have a conversation with somebody who's like talking complete bollocks, and you think, I love this person, I care about this person, but this person is like just so out of it. Each of us need to find our own inspirations, right, on how to keep us going. People come to activism sometimes because they read a book that inspires them. Sometimes they witness an injustice that really triggers them. Sometimes themselves, like me, I think like two things played a role in my life. One was a very terrible personal tragedy, which was my mom committing suicide when I was 15 and she was 38. And the other was at the same time getting involved in the first national student uprising when I was 15 years old. Now, I didn't know everything. At 15, you know, the first march that I was in, the slogan at the front of the march was, "We want equality." The younger kids at the back, by the time the slogan got to them, instead of saying, "We want equality," they were chanting, "We want a color TV," right? But actually, at that time, if I'm brutally honest, I wanted the color TV and equality equally, because kids in white schools had color TVs and kids in black schools had no TVs.
It's important.
Right? But then for me, what keeps me going now is when I was 22 and about to flee into exile, one of my best friends at that time, Kumi Naidoo, asked me, Kumi, we were both to flee in different directions, and he said, Kumi, what is the biggest contribution you can make to the cause of humanity? And I said, giving your life. And he said, you mean going, getting shot and killed and becoming a martyr? I said, I guess so. And then he said, you know, that's a wrong answer. He said, it's not giving your life, but it's giving the rest of your life. I was 22 years old that time. Lenny was like way ahead of us. He was the only person amongst us who got the intersection between racial justice and environmental justice. And at that time, I think he was probably only one of like 5,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent, right? I mean, he was ahead of his time. So, you know, we shed tears as well as two other close friends who were going in with him in the direction. And, you know, we knew in our hearts we might never see each other again. And at 22, you know, when you have to make that decision, it's very painful. And so then 2 years later, or less than 2 years, when I was a student here in the UK, I get the news that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from my home city were brutally murdered by the apartheid regime. There were so many bullets in their bodies, their parents couldn't even recognize them at the mortuary. Of course, I had to think deep and hard about that last conversation, about this distinction he made between giving your life versus giving the rest of your life. What he was basically saying is that we should have an attitude that we don't want to die for our country or die for this issue. We want to live for our country and live for the issue. Put differently, what he was saying is the struggle for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. So I struggle. I really, really struggle, if I'm brutally honest. In fact, today, there's a profile piece that I did with a major South African newspaper, the first I've done since I stepped down from Amnesty International more than a year ago, where I reflect on this, that one of the hardest things, so me, I find, you know how hard it is, I haven't said this before in the way I'm saying it now. You know, one of the hardest things for me personally is that I'm usually invited to things like this and many other things to be there like inspiring chief, you know, to inspire and rally the people. Do you know how hard it is to do that when your heart is telling you we are losing, right? When, you know, so, and for me, I turn to Lenny. Right? That's what I cling on to. And I think what he said was, we have an obligation to continue to push, to strive, to struggle until that injustices are eradicated or until, you know, that challenge is and the one thing that I have not learned well, and I'm only starting to learn now, is trying to be balanced, right? Also recognizing that things are pretty bad, but always looking for the beautiful things around us. The friendships with and by the way, I'm very good at giving the right advice. Very bad at taking it. So like when Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future received the Amnesty Ambassador of Conscience Award, and I was giving them the award in Washington, D.C. in 2019, I said to them, in front of a crowd of about 750 people, I said, please make sure that you don't let the Trumps of the world and the Bolsonaros of the world and the Modis of the world deprive you of your childhood, right? Make sure that as you struggle and fight, have fun, dance, sing, waltz your way into the future, and don't give the benefit of those that have been sitting with the knowledge for decades and decades. They knew that fossil fuels extraction will create this problem. I can show you evidence, not only from 5 decades ago, but from even earlier, that they were sitting with this fact and they hid it. And they manipulated the public debate and so on. Now, they don't say that it's not true. They don't say, but what? So now they're trying to fund the COP. They fund the COPs. You know how crazy that is. That's like asking alcohol companies to fund the meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, that they are funding the COP, right? Paris, the big Paris Agreement, all of it is Total and all these fossil fuel companies. So now, what we've got is, the science is crystal clear now that fossil fuels is driving climate change, one of the main causes. But what they're trying to do, according to, this thing about this guy giving up drinking in a long period from now, is they trying to drag out the life of the fossil fuel industry for as long as possible. And that's what we need to make sure it doesn't happen. The one last thing I would say on this issue about the COP, please keep your expectations low and recognize that irrespective of what comes out of there, on the day one after the COP, the struggle continues and the struggle has to intensify, because we cannot rely on governments that are sitting in the negotiations that have been bought off lock, stock, and barrel, right? Barrel, pardon the pun, by the oil, coal, and gas industry. I mean, think about George Bush, if I can just use him as an example. George Bush, that entire election, when he won it, go look at who funded that election, who made that. It was the fossil fuel companies. And then, when the Iraq War started, eventually they started calling the Iraq War Operation Iraqi Freedom, right, which completely violated international law and so on. But do you know what it was called before Operation Iraqi Freedom? It was called Operation Iraqi Liberation. And then somebody was smart enough said, shit, that's a bit too obvious, because Operation O, Iraqi I, Liberation L would have spelled oil, and it would have been very obvious. So understand that the government sitting there, and I serve on Transparency International, the anti-corruption bodies international council, and the Transparency International had to write to Alok Sharma, the so-called president of the crop pier, and say to him, we have evidence, there was evidence, right, that Greenpeace UK had come up with about secret meetings happening between the government here and the fossil fuel companies about how to handle the negotiations. And so all I'm saying is, when we went to Paris in 2015, we didn't want to say, some people were saying the road to Paris, when you're organizing things, big things like this and preparing people, usually say the road to, and we changed the language. We said, no, let's not say road to Paris, let's say the road through Paris, because there's no way we're going to get what we want out of there. So the challenge here at this COP is to try to get the best out of a defective negotiating process, a defective power dynamic, and then the day it's over, we need to recognize that we intensify all our efforts, because that's the only option we have of securing our children and their children's future.
I think this is an excellent moment to take some questions.
Yes.
Yeah? So love to take some questions from the audience. I don't know how many questions there are, but I was thinking we could do them 2 at a time. And do not worry, if you do not have questions, I have many. So anyone want to ask anything? And then there's a mic if anyone does. Okay.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for talking to us with such wisdom and experience, and it's been fantastic to hear everything you've said. One of the things you spoke about was humility with, great passion, and I think that's so important for activists as well as for politicians, and God knows that's required over in the blue zone as well as here. I've heard what all of the world leaders have said over the last few days. Each of them has stood up, and some of them have spoken almost as beautifully as yourself, and said very powerful things, and made genuine, powerful commitments. And we know they have an excellent record. And you mentioned standing next to two of these people, Mary Robinson and the Prime Minister of Iceland, mourning that iceberg. And it strikes me that not everybody over there has the same degree of cognitive dissonance.
Correct.
In fact, there's a lot of people in that group of 120 people or so who feel the same and are trying to lobby. You hear what all of the African leaders, and I'm not naive about what all of the African presidents have under their umbrellas, but you hear what they had to say when they came together to work on trying to get the West to stick to the African Adaptation Programme. And a lot of them spoke as passionately as you did. Now, as I say, I'm not naive about the idea that they're not, they haven't got their fingers in a lot of pies, but neither do I think they're making it up. So my question is, entirely, and my question is, how do you think, as activists, we, the world, build a bridge over to that other side, and we can move forwards together rather than it being a combative dynamic, because I feel ultimately that's probably what we need to succeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a super excellent question, and the way you framed it was absolutely spot on. And I think I was being a bit loose here by homogenizing everybody there. Small island states in the Pacific, I'm not talking about those leaders where they are dealing with the possibility that the entire countries are going to disappear, right? Kiribati in the Pacific has already leased land in Fiji so that they can relocate the entire population if things don't go where, I was there in 2015 in the Pacific, in Vanuatu, Kiribati, Fiji, and so on, and I learned a shocking slogan and chant. People were chanting, this whole thing about 1.5 degrees, right? They were going 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to, it was just awful.
Yeah, it's not just a number for them.
It was awful hearing it. And then 6 months later, I see them at the Paris climate negotiations, and they asked me to join them for one event and speak. And I went there and I thought, okay, I'll chant, what they taught me 6 months earlier. I go 1.5, and they say, shh, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan was 1.5, we might survive. 1.5, we might survive. So, but you put your finger on exactly the question that we have to become smarter about, right? Because one of the reasons governments actually succeed in controlling us and manipulating us and all, because they understand the power of divide and rule, right? If for us to treat all of them in a homogeneous way would be absolutely stupid, right? Even with African leaders, there are different categories, right? And even those that are corrupt, right, around the world, they know they have to fight now, right? Because their countries, like Bangladesh, for example, already sea level rise is pushing people away from the coast because, the salt water from the sea is messing with the soil and the water table, so they can't even grow food anymore, things like that. So I think in your question lies the biggest challenge, because how do we build narratives and approaches that helps us to build a bridge to the people that are not with us so that they can come over to us? Let me give you a simple example, right? I know now they say there are statistical majorities in Europe and the US even, where young people under 35 believe that capitalism has to be destroyed, right? That, which if you think the US with all the propaganda that goes the other way, that even now you're talking about statistics,
Yeah.
it's quite amazing actually. So let's say that all of us wanted to support these young people, and their slogan the day they launched the campaign was, "Let's smash the capitalist system." The day you launch it, assuming the campaigners are here and all the other people are here, right? In different degrees of disagreement with the people here disagreeing the most. The day you launch the campaign, you know what you've done? You've pushed everybody further away from you. Because the propaganda and the thing that's gone into people's minds, even if somebody's a worker in some Coca-Cola or some factory, they think, hey, I'm part of the capitalist system, even though they're getting the crumbs from the system, right? So what does activism lose if activism says, let's build an economy that includes everybody and does not destroy the environment? If you chose that narrative, it doesn't mean that everybody that disagrees with you is going to jump in bed with you tomorrow, but at least you've not pushed them further away from you, and you create the possibility of creating a dialogue and a conversation to win people over. So that's one of the things that we need to do. With the heads of state, the truth is, most of them are in a crisis themselves, right? And in their crisis, there's weakness, right? And in that weakness offers the possibility for us to push them in positive directions. But the reality is it's a handful of countries that control this planet, right? And sadly, for some bizarre reason, Britain, as a has-been superpower, is one of those countries, right? Nuclear weapons is a factor, right? Those countries that hold nuclear weapons give them a certain... I mean, think about it. Why should the UK have a veto at the Security Council?
This is a much bigger conversation.
Huh?
This is a much bigger
Yeah.
conversation.
No, oh yeah, sorry. No, I know the point. Yeah, that's true. But what I'm saying is that, sorry, thank you so much. I love your question so much, and I didn't mean to be so black and white in how I said it, and thank you for calling me out on it, and I hope I clarified. And in your question is the challenge for all of us. How do we be more strategic? How do we figure out who we can win over faster? What some people will call low-hanging fruit, and that's the least developed countries in the world. We win them over first. But you see, those countries you win over, they're not going to change the dynamic because they don't control the fossil fuel industry, for example.
Do we have time for one more question? Yeah, let's take one more question. I think there was one in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Dion Shikuza, and I'm from Namibia. I equally associate with the previous speaker's opening comments about your reflections. Very inspiring. It's the first time I come across somebody who somehow has similar background in terms of the injustices we went through and still choosing to fight for something as conscious and complex as the environment. And I wanted to know how you managed to stay focused in that, given that we come from a place where the environment is a subject of a small minority, the white community, so to speak, and up to 70% of the land basically is also in their hands. So we live in shacks, we live in informal settlements. The only oceans we see are maybe corrugated iron sheets of shacks. And it's very difficult to think about the environment when you don't have access to it. It's so far from you. And especially when black people back home think those are for white people, you shouldn't be focused on such issues. How did you navigate your way around that? Because it's very inspiring to see this. In fact, I always get asked, how many trees have you planted? What are you doing? And I'm like, if only you knew where I come from. I can't also just stand up and plant a tree it's very difficult. So I focus more on a higher level because there I use democracy and rule of law and things like that to help myself. So how did you do it, especially during your era where it was much more hard-pressed and straightforward and direct? I just want to know how you navigated through those challenges of a racist society that is unapologetically not inclusive at all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, my brother. And as for those of you know, we are neighbors. But you know, Donald Trump in the United Nations was trying to praise Namibia, but he ended up praising another country altogether called Nambia, which doesn't exist. But thank you for, again, a wonderfully helpful question. So when I was growing up as a young activist in Durban, you know, right until I fled South Africa, and I must be honest, I, like everybody else, thought that environmental activism and environmental issues was what rich people and white people did. So I grew up that. My friend Lenny was different, right? The one who was murdered, right? I didn't get it, honestly. But I must honestly say to you, I'm embarrassed that I got it so late.
What was your light bulb moment?
My light bulb moment was when I was the chair of the global call. So, you know, I was hearing global warming, climate change, and so on. But I think when it like kind of just hit me fully, like, it's not to say that I didn't have some consciousness and awareness, but where it kind of got into my stomach was when Hurricane Katrina happened, right? And here was the richest country on the planet, right? And there was a situation where people died in the hundreds, right? Mostly people of color and white working class folks, right? And I realized, I knew before that, but you know, you're asking me when did it really come underneath your skin, then you can't do anything about it but to act. You know, I remember sitting with a friend of mine from Nigeria, Justice Aguare, in a hotel in Ghana, where we were there to launch the Make Poverty History Ghana chapter, right? And I remember Justice telling me, Kumi, you know, in Africa, we are poor. But when our people die, we do everything in our capability to give them a dignified funeral and a send-off. The poorest people have this in them. And what was happening there in the streets of New Orleans was George Bush was issuing a shoot-to-kill order for anybody who was looting. People had to loot because there was no water, right, for example, right? And he was saying, look at there. And we were watching on CNN, you know, bodies, dead bodies, that piece of the clothing was tied onto stop signs, you know, just to make sure that they didn't completely flow. And I feel very emotional about it because 2 months after that, Justice Aguare and 2 other close comrades launched the Nigeria chapter of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, which I was the chair of at that time. And they died in a plane crash flying from Lagos to... But I think I always think that Justice Aguare helped me see it, that we had to not say, you know, the environment is an important issue, but there's, you know, the environmentalists and they'll take care of it. But I moved from that to understanding that one of the things we've made as a big mistake as activists throughout the world and for a long time now was ignoring a wisdom that was given to us as a gift, actually, from the feminist movement. Decades ago, the feminist movement gave us a very powerful concept, but unfortunately, a very cumbersome word, in the word intersectionality. The feminist movement said if you want to advance gender equality, you needed to understand how gender interacted with race, class, ability, religion, and so on. And we have to, and you know, when I was appointed head of Greenpeace, the first month, like, because I was the first person from the global south that was appointed and blah, blah, I was like only doing interviews. I eventually had to tell the communications director, please, I want to start my real job. I can't just do interviews here. But you know what was, and also one of the reasons it was getting exceptionally boring, because the main question they would ask me is, oh, so now you've given up on poverty and human rights and gender equality and you're going to the environment. But I want to say honestly, right, by that time, I was strongly of the view that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change and prevent biodiversity collapse, and the struggle to ensure human rights, gender equality, and eradicate inequality and poverty must, can, and should be seen as two sides of the same coin. Has to. And that was a mistake I made for the better part of my life, not seeing it. And you see, the issue is we're not politicians, right? Like I'm saying for myself. And politicians seem to put themselves under a terribly stupid pressure, which is they want to always pretend that things are really okay and that they never make mistakes. I think it's okay for us to say and so I'm saying to you, I made a mistake. And I'm embarrassed that it took me so long to this thing. And you know, when journalists would ask me, why did you take the Greenpeace job? I consciously decided to give an answer which was true, but was not very wasn't very adult of me or not very professional of me to give. You know what the answer was? So when Greenpeace approached me for the job, to consider, to be a candidate, I was on day 19 of an hunger strike, right? To put pressure on the South African government, as my friends in Zimbabwe used to put it, to stop being like a condom to Robert Mugabe, right? And well, actually, the day I launched the hunger strike all over Joburg, there was a sign saying, Mbeki, who was the president then, stop being a condom to Mugabe. Because we launched a video that I'd gone underground at Christmas and recorded with activists in Zimbabwe. And I forgot what point I was trying to make.
When they approached you for the job at Greenpeace.
Oh, yeah. So then what I saw in Zimbabwe, and I don't know whether you know this, but Zimbabwe is like the food basket of Southern Africa. The soil is like black gold, right? And when Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, was at the inauguration of Mugabe when he was elected in 1980, he turned to him and said, Prime Minister Mugabe, you are inheriting the jewel of Africa. Please take good care of her. And then I'm there underground in Zimbabwe in 2008, and I see, my brother, people starving like I've never seen. Even the policemen and the army guys who were stopping us at roadblocks and harassing us, their pants was falling down. You could see that they were starving, right? Nothing in the shops and so on. So when I came back, I spoke to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and we decided to launch a hunger strike. So Archbishop Tutu called for it, and then I anchored the first 21 days, and then people were... And this was not to put pressure on Mugabe, it was put pressure on Mbeki to stop acting like a condom to Robert Mugabe, as it was said. So on day 19 of the hunger strike, I get a call from the people from... So my daughter saw me on BBC TV. She was living with her mum in the UK. And she calls and she says, she said, Dad, why are you still doing interviews? Didn't you say that you need to conserve your energy because you doing the hunger strike? Because that's the doctor said, must conserve what energy I shouldn't be doing. So I said, no, I only did the only call I took today was these people called me from Amsterdam, and and that BBC thing, I did it 2 days ago or something. And then she said, who called from Amsterdam? So I said, no, this Greenpeace people called and asked without consider being a candidate. And she said, what did you say? I said, no, I said to them, thanks very much. I'm very, humbled, but it's very bad timing. You couldn't choose a worse timing. I've not eaten food for 19 days. I can't consider making a decision. And then you know what she said to me? She said, Dad, I won't talk to you if you don't seriously consider that job when you finish your stupid hunger strike. Because you don't understand that climate change affects my future and affects my generation's future. So when anybody asks me, why did I join Greenpeace? I said, because my daughter asked me to do, right? And I consciously wanted to say that. And I said it for 6 years that I was at Greenpeace, because I was wanting to say to people, listen, if the head of Greenpeace needed his daughter to give him a kick in the butt and get with the program, nobody should be ashamed about joining at whatever age they join it. So that's why I say to people, when you're talking to people right now, your friends and family and so on, please make them not feel guilty for not being where you might be. Build a bridge to them to help them get to where you are. There's no time here for us to be vindictive, to be small-minded, to be narrow in our thinking. We have to be generous in our spirit and open to actually helping people want to get involved. And also, you know, must remind people that activism is pretty sexy as well.
I think that might be where we have to end, actually.
I thought you might want to end there.